Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. And this month, Yatogami has chosen media as transformative. Yatogami says, for my June Parley, I'd like to shift topics from games as animals that require care and feeding to games as interactive fiction. Cool. This discussion was prompted by a quote from author Donna Tartt, I'm not familiar, that recently crossed my desk. I've perused the full 2013 interview, link below, but didn't see any context that would significantly alter interpretations of the expressed sentiment. So I'm about to read you a quote from this article. We're not going to get into the rest of the article. I don't know this person. If this is a misinterpretation, it's just an example. This is not meant to be a judgment on this person. It doesn't matter. We're using this as a place to begin discussion. If this is a misinterpretation, that does not matter. This is a place to start a discussion about our interpretation. Quote, in films, we are voyeurs, but in novels, we have the experience of being someone else, knowing another person's soul from the inside. No other art form does that. And this is why sometimes when we put down a book, we find ourselves slightly altered as human beings. Novels change us from within. End quote. Although the quote refers to novels, I believe the idea of media as a source of transformative experiences can be adapted to video games. To more deeply consider the original scope, Tartt seems to be speaking about novels within a first-person perspective specifically. The interview from which the quote was taken focused on Tartt's interpretation of The Goldfinch, which recounts the story of Theo Decker from his point of view. Compared to something like a graphic novel or movie, a first-person novel necessarily puts the reader in the perspective character's head to some extent. This, according to Tartt, allows the reader to know a person's soul from the inside. She claims that no other art form does this, but I would contend that she hasn't explored the world of video games. Yeah, for real, this person just hasn't even played video games. In the modern world of digital animation, one could argue that the chief distinction between movies and games is that the latter necessarily involves active player engagement, while the former tends toward passive reception, simply watching. For story-driven games with narrative choices, I think the requisite player engagement could give rise to sorts of transformative experiences like the ones Tartt describes, even without a first-person framing. With the lengthy preamble out of the way, that was a good intro. What are your thoughts on various types of media as vectors for transformative experiences? And then there's a spoilered out part that I'll get to later. Cool, yeah, I'm quite interested in this topic. When I graduated college, part of my final project, it was called my capstone at my school, was to analyze the specific technique that an author was going for in a book. I did this for 2 novels, and then I was meant to write my own novella, basically a novel, but shorter, that used both techniques. So I was trying to pick 2 books that each had very specific, like writerly techniques, things they were trying to do, and combine them into a single text of my own. And the 2 books I picked were Sphinx by Anne Garretta and Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World by Haruki Murakami. You'll note that these books are both translated. Anne Garretta writes in French and Murakami writes in Japanese. These are both translations. I did that on purpose. I said that I didn't want to imitate the author's direct style as much as possible. I wanted to focus on works where what I would be focused on was the techniques, the structural techniques that the author chose to use, the purposes of the works. And that's complicated in both cases. Japanese and French are both very particular languages. In any case, maybe a story for another time, but it's quite relevant to this. I took a lot of poetry classes in college, and my teacher gave me this sheet, and she was a great poetry professor. And I had her a lot of times, and she gave me this sheet a few times, and it's got 10 questions to ask of a poem. And I had this on my wall for years, and I'd written a line and then an 11th question that said, "What does it do?" question mark. I believe that a good poem does something, endeavors to do something. It might not be something active, and I believe that that is part of the distinction here. Just like you say, Yatogami, I think a lot of the distinction between these different art forms changing a person is the ways that a non-interactive or defined by being uninteractive art form changes people, and the way an interactive art form would change people. However, I think there's a lot of types of art that frequently decide one way or the other what they intend to be. There's a lot of poems that don't intend to, I would say, aggress the reader, make them do something to affect them directly. There are other poems that instead are really attempting to affix a moment in space and let you simply look at it. These are maybe closer to a less interactive work, whereas there are definitely poems that I believe are attempting to pull you in. They're trying to interact with you in some way. Now, all reading, novels, prose and poetry, involves you, to some extent, usually picturing what you're reading in your head. And you could argue that that is interactive in a way. But I do believe that you can write works using prose and poetry in a way that blurs the line, in a way that is relevant to this parlay. As you can see, for once in my life, I may actually be legitimately qualified to talk about this topic, which is disgusting, I know, but please, don't worry. We'll get back to complete nonsense in just a moment. Just check my college degree out there real quick and get back to the show. Right, so I would like to divide the media we discuss into interactive and not. And of course, there is really no line, in my opinion. This is a matter of relativity. But there are definitely pieces of media that are trying to be more or less interactive within their mediums, which are also trying to be more or less interactive, creating maybe a sliding scale. Let's do it that way. Maybe if I use specific works as an examples, I'll say, I think the medium is overall more or less interactive, and the piece is overall more or less interactive. Maybe on a scale from, less interactive. Okay, that's actually not 3 different places on the scale, more or less interactive, and more or more interactive. Whatever. Probably getting a bit too complicated there, and the degree is right out the window, completely unqualified. Yes. Before we get into specific examples, though, I think it's also worth thinking about transformative experiences, not just, what works are trying to do, which I do think is sort of the topic of this parlay, but also what makes an experience transformative. And this is a thing I think is a lot simpler. Generally, I believe these are gradual experiences. It is not common that someone is, affected by something that hasn't been affecting them for a little while. Generally, this is something where they get worn down and brought to a threshold, and then there's something that is like the final straw, or it pushes them just over the fence. The dam finally breaks. Any number of metaphors. I believe that is how humans make decisions. It's not usually based on, one thing. It's about hitting a threshold with a thing, which means in practice, I believe it's gradual. Now, novels, just to start somewhere, are in some ways a good fit for this. If you read a little bit of it every night, it does wear away at that part of you, possibly building up to a change it might make in you over the days that you read it. Maybe over the course of a few weeks or a month, which is not so long as for it to become completely commonplace. It feels like it is an event that is passing, and yet not short enough that it doesn't have some time to work its way, right? So I think that that's a very good amount of time. I think gradual, but also specifically a medium amount of time is a very good chunk of time for change. Second thing, I believe that transformative experiences are fundamentally emotional rather than logical, and it doesn't matter if you're more of a logical person in general. I'm a person who feels quite strongly that people need to think through the reasoning for things. I believe most people are guilty of magic thinking most of the time. Things just kind of happen for reasons, and they accept like, oh, that's a thing. Things can just be things. They don't have to have reasons for being things. Things can just happen, and there's no reasons for things. And I hate this. It's my least favorite thing about the entire world, and it ruins my life every single day. And I hate that. But I too, as someone who hates that, not the most logical person on earth or anything, but even if you feel that way, I believe that we are still mostly affected by emotions. That threshold is in some ways an emotional one, in my opinion. The logic isn't gone. It's not that we're inherently emotional and completely illogical. I think that that is dismissive. People have said that on this very channel before, and I think that is short-sighted. We are obviously a mix of the two things. My point is simply that they really just have different roles. And I think that a lot of people use their logic as a sort of sustained part of their everyday life, whereas emotions are things that happen Well, in the moment. There are things where things come to a head, we almost retreat to emotion, you might say. Things that are further down in our minds, that doesn't mean that those are the things that are truer of us, I don't believe. But I do think that they're what's there when we get to a sort of tipping point in life. Armed relatively more or less, and having arrived relatively more or less at that point, using our logic. I don't think it's accurate to say that that means we're defined by our emotions. That situation is as much, if not more, defined by logic as our emotions. But I do believe that these transformative experiences operate on emotion, personally. Finally, I think that there's a strong element in a transformative experience in media of the piece being in some way taken seriously. It doesn't necessarily have to be that the person isn't feeling casual about the thing. For example, I don't take Apex Legends seriously as per se. Maybe I should say it this way. I don't treat Apex Legends with reverence as per se, but it has had a big effect on me. Playing Battle Royale games, and I've played the most Apex Legends, has had an effect. It is, in some ways, an activity of monk-like discipline if you don't constantly rage. It is very difficult to not feel like I spent all this time running around, I looted for 20 minutes and then suddenly died, or like I jumped down, missed one keystroke and was instantly killed by someone who picked up a better gun than me, or I didn't get a gun at all. The most common thing you'll hear when you hear me and my friends playing Apex Legends together is no guns, no guns, no guns. Everybody will be chanting no guns, no guns, no guns. Why there are no guns? No guns drop in this game. Drop guns. Why are there no guns? Gun control, by the way. I hope the YouTube algorithm understands that I think that people need to stop buying firearms, for goodness sakes. But in Apex Legends, maybe. The firearms factory needs to speed up production a little bit. Anyway, yes, I do think that reverence is the key word here. There's a way in which sometimes this is reliant on the individual, and sometimes it's more the impression that the piece of media takes. For example, I think that the idea that I take some reverence into Apex Legends is more unique to me. There's not a lot about that game that is prompting that. Although because of the absolutely brutal nature of a battle royale game, you hardly ever win. You pretty much just go in and die. You know you're going to drop in and die. You don't expect to win if you're a normal player and not a professional a lot of the time. That does theoretically prompt some level of discipline, but I believe that takes a lot of personal input, not to brag. This is just the kind of person I am. I take it seriously as a time to have fun and focus on self-betterment a little bit. Wouldn't it be good to be able to do this thing and not get upset? And so I try very hard. And I do think that's made my life better, but in a way a little specific to me. You see how that definitely is a collaboration between the game and me. That's not all coming from the game, but it's also not irrelevant to the game. And the same thing with me. Likewise, I think that extremely blatantly silly things are, sometimes they create an attitude where somebody watching them feels there's almost some self-criticism. They would feel ridiculous to take that thing seriously, which I do believe fights this type of thing. I'm not saying you can't or people don't have transformative experiences using these types of media, just that I don't think that helps. I don't think it correlates there. A novel is often a very pensive thing. You sit down, it's generally very quiet, and you just read the thing, probably mostly on your own, oftentimes at like the beginning and the end of the day as well, or in a peaceful moment in the afternoon. These are things that occupy a period of time that creates, the word I'm using here is reverence. And I think that again, it's not like media either does or doesn't evoke this at all. It's relative, but there definitely are types of media that correlate with this. I believe that simply our culture's attitude about reading a book suggests that people won't laugh at you if you read a book and you say it changed your life. But if you play a video game and it changed your life, well, I certainly won't laugh at you. But do you see what I'm trying to say? I do think that matters a lot. People being open to changing is basically what I'm roundaboutedly approaching here. Cool. So having talked about what makes a transformative experience and the idea that media may or may not actually be attempting to do something to you, I'd like to get into some specific examples, which I imagine is a lot of what you would like, and of course, different types of media. That's what we're going to go through. Something I'd like to say before we begin is to think about different learning styles. I don't have a whole lot to say about this. I'm not really an expert on that subject, but as something I don't know a lot about, I want you to think about as we go through these how you might think like that wouldn't do much for me, but maybe a different learning style would be very well catered to that. Maybe that would transform people more if they had that preference for learning. If they were comfortable with learning that way. Learning styles are complicated. Anyway, so video games. Of course, the obvious reason why a video game would be transformative is because you literally perform the actions. I'd like to contrast these with tabletop games, though. In a tabletop game, you move these pieces, you manipulate these parts, you move, locomote a lot more, stereotypically. I think VR games are also an interesting middle ground there. Tabletop games with where you use all these physical objects in a physical space, I believe do have this interesting other component where they are in some way real, I guess. They might feel more or less gamey in different ways, and you can see how I won't get into this every time, I promise, but how that would fire differently for different people. Some people might consider a tabletop game more gamey, more gamery, or less. It would depend. It might feel more silly. It's not as immersive, maybe you would say, or it might feel more tactile, more concrete. That could feel more or less like a game to some people, which might make them take it more or less seriously. It's hard to say, but I do think they're different. I think in a tabletop game, you're also often like physically with other people. I wonder that is good. I feel like being with other people maybe does interrupt that experience a little. Even in a movie theater, when you would frequently be with others, there is a way in which you're a little more alone. Movie theaters have this interesting public-private thing going on, where you can have a sort of private-ish experience, much like how if you read a book in the library, there's probably other people there, but it feels appreciably private, if that makes sense. To a lot of people anyway. I actually don't feel that way at all. I become hyper aware of the other people, but that's specific to me. Other folks tell me that they find it pretty much the same, so go figure. It would depend on the person. But yeah, I do think there's something about there being other people there that you're explicitly interacting with, or like being on a mic with other people. I gave my Apex Legends example when I play that video game. They're not physically there, but I am hearing their voices. To me, that makes me take it almost more seriously because I'm not only trying to change something about myself actively, I'm testing it right now. It's like a live trial by fire, literally, to be good at that thing. And I personally find that does something for me, but it would depend on the person. Again, there's a melodrama to self change, which I think is bad. Changing yourself should be normal, just like switching out a microchip. And eventually it will be just like that. I think that people are hesitant to change themselves. They sort of idolize how they are. They put that's just how I am on a pedestal as a comfortable excuse, and I believe that you do whatever you want, but that holds you back. There's nothing good about the way that you just happen to be. That is a starting point. And you can take pride in it and respect it while mercilessly modifying it because it is inferior. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but you do you. Anyway, I don't think people are as willing to do that when other people are around. So I think that's interesting. Movies, tabletop games. Tabletop games are something that is pretty tactile, interactive. You kind of physically do the thing in the game. And yet tabletop games are also often quite abstracted. So they're not as literal in some sense. Whereas when you play Call of Duty, you literally shoot people. You shoot people that look like people. It looks like you're shooting people in real life. It's the same as that experience visually in a lot of ways. But obviously, the definition of a sane person is that they can tell the difference between reality and fiction. People don't necessarily do that because it's a thing in video games. I'm glad our culture kind of grew out of that to some extent. Some folks haven't grown up yet, but a lot of people kind of get that nowadays. I think that's an interesting distinction. Does that make it more removed or less? And again, I think this would depend on the person. But video games, yeah, do in a way have you act out the thing that you're doing in the game in a way that you might not when you watch a movie. I'd like to go back to novels as an example, though. Anne Garetta's Sphinx does this pretty interesting thing where the way I described it in my thesis was it bullies you out of using gender. So you might have a lot of questions. You said it was French. The French language has gender. What? Huh? Weird. And I don't know enough French to have read it in French, so I don't know how she's doing that in French. My point wasn't to focus on that. That was not the focus of my piece. The point of the book is to I think kind of shunt the reader into thinking that gender is useless. The book features is it you? I think it is you. This was a while ago. I last read it. Anyway, it's from first or second person. I believe second. And the thing about that is that your gender is not defined, or this person's gender is not defined. If you were going to write a book that obfuscated gender, there are a couple options. You could just avoid everything that makes people think about gender, but this book takes the opposite approach. Instead, it rapid fires at you things that make you think, oh, they're female stereotypically in our society. Oh, they're male stereotypically in our society. Over and over and over and over again, until eventually you just give up. It proves to you it's useless to think of that way. Stop it. And then eventually, you as the reader, hopefully, if it's worked, this is just my interpretation, by the way, I hope you know that, are sort of exhausted out of using that mental tool, sort of proving to you that it is often a bit artificial. If you draw a conclusion like that every time, it seems like the world is defined that way, but this is giving you an example of like, but what if it just isn't? Like, and then you can decide. The thing the book does in that sense would be that you then maybe apply a little bit of that way of thinking to your life outside of that. Now, this was something that unfortunately for Anne Garetta, I already thought this way, and so I just found it very interesting. I had thought, well, what if we just avoid all the gender stuff? I had kind of been doing it that way, but this book really took the opposite approach, really took a very aggressive, hands-on approach, a very destructive approach, and tried to say, I know you're going to stereotype everything with gender, average reader, so I'm just going to force you not to, or to make it useless to do that, basically. It will become foolish to continue doing that. From everything from the way the characters' clothes move, to the bathroom they go into, to there's so many things we can't even get into it now. If you're interested, read the book. And again, it's possible that somehow this actually isn't the point of the book, and that was like some odd artifact of translation. But the book definitely is about gender in some mechanical way that is doing something to your perception of it, which is what I found interesting. So I hope you can see how that's something that the book sort of does in a way other than just, the way that your quote is suggesting, Yatogami, in a way other than just providing you with a source of simulating another person's thoughts, where you, as you read the book, you're being asked to, the I is someone else, and you're meant to simulate their thoughts. In the text of the book, it says what they're thinking, and you kind of go through that process. It sort of walks you through that. This is doing it in a different, I would almost say somewhat more active way, where it's not just part of the process of reading the book where you gradually simulate this thought process of this other person and come to know their soul from the inside. This book that I'm describing as an example is sort of directly natural selecting a thought process in you, which is a very different way to do that. Haruki Murakami's Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World does something yet again different. This book is 2 stories is how it's presented, Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World, and every other chapter is one or the other. You see the next part of the story. Without spoiling anything, at the beginning, these are very different, and it has the effect of carrying over the feeling like a flavor still in your mouth after having eaten something to the next page. You finish a page of the more abstract of the two stories, and you are still in that frame of mindset when you get this very concrete story right after that. Again, if that sounds interesting, read the book. I enjoyed these books. I didn't just read them academically. They're not going to be boring. Like, go read them. Well, maybe you'll find them boring, but anyway, they're not like really long either, by the way. And if you're thinking, wow, combining those two things, the gender use bullying thing and the contrast thing, the flavor saver between the pages, if you're thinking that would make a bit of a disaster as like all in one story, you would be correct, and that's a story for another time. We're not going to talk about what I wrote. That can go over there with the diploma I threw out earlier. But the point is, these are all stories that I believe are doing something that could be transformative to the reader in some way. Probably Murakami's book is doing it the least. That's just doing something that benefits the book, something that is not anywhere on the page of the chapters of the book has affected their text. You just read something fantastical, and now you're reading something concrete that has cursory similarities that causes your brain to fire from that feeling of reading the fantastical part from just a page before. Maybe that's not asking you to retain some long-term effect, but you can see how it definitely is doing something in a arguably passive way, I guess. It just happens over and over again. You kind of practice that feeling, and it translates into everyday life. My professor told me that after reading that book, she said that my normal writing was like half and half between the two chapters, and that I was really taking some strong inspiration, she put it politely, from that book, which is true. It did leave an impression on my writing style. Which I'm not is good or bad. I have no choice. It's there. And she said that I was writing about locations she'd been in a way that makes her feel like she didn't live her life, which that is very flattering, but also maybe really bad, completely unrelatable in any case. There's a topic looming large in this discussion about the kind of the elephant in the room is relatable experiences. Maybe to make someone have a transformative experience, it has to be something that they can tie to in some way. I think that people often misunderstand what relatable really means. Things can be quite out there and still be relatable if they hit the chords of the human experience. In fact, I would argue that as long as somebody writes something that isn't contrived, they will probably have found something that they find passion to write about because it resonates with things that are true to the human experience. I think a lot of stories with real skill and effort in their delivery that are clearly delivered, that's pretty much what writing skill is, in my opinion. They're a clear vision of what the person had great passion about, almost always resonate with people. Like, I feel like it's actually not very hard exactly to write something relatable. It's just, it happens after you're really good at everything else, which is very hard. So I don't know. I haven't been talking about that, but that is something to consider. Now, before I said when I was comparing these different approaches that the experience of reading a novel and you're going through this first person experience with someone is quite passive and gradual, I said, almost by accident, which I was saying before I think is a hallmark of the transformative experience. I do not think that something being more interactive is necessarily going to make it more transformative. And here's where I'm finally going to wrap around to talking about video games. Yeah, I think, of course, the fact that you are doing something and you're seeing the image of the thing and it's this theoretically immersive experience, that could be seen as being more immersive, more interactive, which means it's more transformative. You are more enacting the steps that the game involves. But a few things. First of all, I think that good transformation is also not disruptive. It's subtle, it's gentle. Maybe that's the best way to say it. And another thing is that a lot of video games are immersive and appealing because they allow you to more fully do a thing, more actively do a thing that you cannot normally do, which is in some at least superficial way not as relatable. So I do think there's a double-edged sword there. I think a gentle touch is surprisingly effective, which makes movies. It's interesting. We've brought up movies a few times, both you and the writer. I think film is largely fairly good at creating these transformative experiences. For a lot of people, it's fairly formative. It's often an outing if they actually go to the theater, which I do think helps. Like there's a thing in memory where binding it to sort of a place, you went to a location, the place you were in when you watch a film, I believe matters a bit more than in a lot of other kinds of media, which seems meaningful to me. I personally believe that when you go to an art gallery, the layout of the art gallery has a fairly large effect on your experience of the work inside it. It is not secondary. Like the art gallery is a piece of art, and it affects the pieces inside it. This is not some kind of great revelation. Most artists and art galleries also think that, but just to say that I can remember rather keenly many museums or art galleries that I've been to. They were particular. I remembered being there, and I remember some of the pieces I saw in there because there was this whole experience to seeing that piece. I think video games crucially lose that a lot of the time. Even if they were in a very particular experience. I remember when I first played Pyre at PAX East in Boston, when Pyre wasn't out yet. I played Pyre's PvP and thought, what the heck? Who are the people that made this? Why is the transistor game basketball? What? Huh? I mean, it was awesome. I loved it. But my friend and I were both like, what was that? What? Is that the new game? Like, what's happening? And the developer was right there, like, yeah, it's kind of weird. And we were like, yeah, it's what? How do you play this? And he was like, it's basketball. And we were like, okay, sure, man, that's fun. It was great. Don't get me wrong, but what I'm trying to say is just that I remember that space very keenly. But playing a video game in on your computer, in your office, your room, wherever, I do think something about the immersiveness of that removes some of the locational context that is an element of change in our minds. I do think that is. I'm surprised to be saying, as we're wrapping up this parlay, that I actually don't think video games are quite as effective as they would initially seem. It makes a lot of sense. Again, I think it's obvious that video games, you actually do a thing. You'd think that would be very transformative. And don't get me wrong, I think a lot of video games are very transformative. I think it is a medium that is strong at this. And of course, this writer, if they said no other medium does this, yeah, they just haven't played that many video games apparently, because video games clearly do this. This is something that video games probably do more directly than most other forms of media. I'm not going to say any other form of media. I've learned from that mistake, but yeah, this is something that on the surface, video games do very directly, much more directly than most forms of media. If you play a first-person video game that is story-focused, you are very directly experiencing exactly what the person has to say. And I'll note, sometimes those things create a big disconnect with the player. Sometimes the player doesn't like that they have to make the choice the character made or whatever. Making a game with choices is hard. You often have to present the player with situations where there are few choices at all. Like logically, there are just very few choices, so that they can make all of them pickable, because otherwise it's just sort of impossible to simulate at the moment. This is part of the strength of something like D&D. I, your DM, can interpret essentially anything that you say you want to do. So I can give you open-ended choices without it feeling like you have no choice. Or if I make it feel like you don't have that much of a choice, you might not like that as much. But anyway, so I don't know. I think there's an interesting relationship there where, as a matter of fact, having the player be more immersed, it might not be the trick. It's more about a sweet spot. And I actually think that video games that are more of a flow experience, those might be games that would really affect you in a more prominent way, rather than games that are deliberately trying to. We do need a few examples before I go. The first one I want to talk about is the Stanley Parable. This is a game where, if you haven't played it, this is a minor spoiler that happens in like 1 minute. You are a person walking, and a narrator is telling you what you're going to do. And for a little bit of the very, very early part of the game, you don't have any choice. So you do what the narrator tells you to do for the most part. I mean, you could just stand still. But anyway, then you come to a set of doors. and the narrator says that you take one door, but of course you retain full control. You can take the other door, and the narrative adapts to what you've said. The narrator, as a character, kind of snidely comments on how you didn't do what you were supposed to do, which is quite interesting. This is a game that's provoked a lot of people's imagination because it does enact this feeling of defying the narrative. It is sort of a response to the immersive novel. And then, well, what if you controlled the character and just didn't do the plot of the novel? You could do that. And I think that really plays up the difference between how a video game immerses you and how a novel immerses you. Another key point that I'm surprised I haven't gotten to, well, of course, it's that in a game that allows you to have control and enact things, you could simply not play along. You could just not do what the game is suggesting that you do. In Skyrim, you can not live as though you actually care about your well-being and standing in the world. The game has systems to try to make it so that matters, but you can defy them. You will defy them. And so, yeah, it's an option you have. But by the very token that the game is really including you in that world, really immersing you in that world, you are allowed to not learn the lesson the game is trying to teach you. That's another way to say it. Whereas in a novel, you sort of can't unless you just don't pay attention. But it's more linear. That's my point. Another example would be World of Warcraft. This is an example of a game where vanilla World of Warcraft, original a long time ago, 20 years ago, World of Warcraft, was a game where at the higher levels of play, to kind of complete the content in the game, you had to communicate with other people a significant amount, or you were at least very heavily rewarded for making a decent attempt to communicate with other people. And this meant that it was a game that encouraged you to be a kind of person very directly. Again, it was a game that went beyond just having you enact being a certain kind of person. The game was almost some assembly required for your personality, which I believe is going a bit past having a transformative experience to you can't even play this game unless you become like a subset of kind of people, let's say it that way, which is maybe not the same thing, but I think that's quite interesting. What else? What other examples? I thought that a game I haven't played, but that I bet would be really interesting for this conversation is Inscription. Inscription is a game where you're like trapped in a house with a scary person and you have to play card games with them. That's all I know about Conspiracy. Inscription, the Magic the Gathering draft format, Conspiracy. A great draft format. Anyway, yeah, I'm interested to play that game. I feel like that would have an interesting commentary here. I'm trying to think what else. There's a good amount of games that are sort of like a metaphor or an allegory for a certain kind of the human condition. Greece is an example of a game I've played a little of that is demonstrating something about being human, something about this character in a, I would say, like metaphorical or allegorical way. I think that Hollow Knight is a good lesson in a game that the mood of Hallownest is very grim, but there are these pops of happiness, joy, life, color, beauty in there in a way that I found deeply relatable to normal life, and which did make me feel like maybe we can have a sense of awe at how terrible things are sometimes, and take reverence in the moments that are more positive. There's that word again. That game left a deep impression on me. I'm not sure it affected me that much as per se, but it did definitely give me a feeling like if I needed to learn a lesson this game was teaching, I probably would have. It created a tone where I probably would have. I think that's interesting. These games that give you the right amount of freedom, maybe. Another thing I think is interesting about Hollow Knight is how it allows you to, you might just have to practice a boss and become good at them, but Hollow Knight does let you play the game rather non-linearly. You could decide a boss is giving you too much trouble, come back later when you have more charms and stuff, and are maybe more equipped to beat the boss, or you upgraded your nail or whatever, you know. That is something the game lets you do. And that experience of trying to persevere but having the option to regroup and then come back later in this kind of controlled space, it does kind of have you practice that healthy way of interacting with your life, where sometimes you must persevere, other times you ought to regroup. And I don't think that that's a bad way to put the player through the motions. I think the common thread here, though, is that a lot of these games are doing it by being kind of a middle ground. They're not entirely immersive. They're doing the thing a bit indirectly. Or maybe a better way to say it is that they're doing it atmospherically. They're allowing you to be in a world that is a place where you would learn the thing that the game wants to show you, rather than being things that beeline the thing that they want to show you. They're just worlds in which that is a thing. They're worlds defined by that thing, and then you go in them and do your thing. I think that when these games are immersive, when these types of stories are immersive, yeah, maybe they do the trick, or maybe that's just for me, but that's what I think. You could say a lot more about this topic. I have said a lot already, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that was a decent way to approach answering this. You do have a spoilered out part that I'm going to read. I focus on games here, Yatogami says, because the interactive element sets them apart as a medium, but strong emotional resonances are possible with other non-novel, non-game media, in my experience. My position is that these resonances are what draw the audience into a work, and that investment can lead them to adapt their mentality based on the experience with the work. In other words, the audience can only get as much out of a work as they put in. Indifference will not affect change. That's well done, a use of effect. Yes, I agree. I think that there is an element of, the good thing about video games in some ways is that you will put in something. There is a way in which you could read a book, you can complete a book much more easily without engaging with it at all than you can complete a video game without engaging with it at all. And so that's an interesting trade-off. I said how I think you can be too immersive in some way, but you could also be not immersive enough. And I think video games are quite strong at avoiding that problem. That's an interesting way to think of it. I think a difficulty with novels is that the reader might simply have difficulty simulating these things in their head. Video games do give you a lot of help. In theory, I think they're a pretty accessible, immersive, or transformative medium. That's an interesting point. I hadn't approached it that way before. But yeah, I strongly agree too that the audience does need to put something in. Generally it doesn't just happen. Again, I think there is an element of adapting though. As long as the player keeps playing Hollow Knight, they will hopefully adapt to the things that Hollow Knight asks them to be. And that is a way that as long as the player keeps playing, they might, have been incepted to learn a certain thing. Whereas in other types of media, it may be a little bit more of a crapshoot whether the person puts in enough that they can get out, this change in themselves. Really living with the characters in a novel. I believe that in the quote we started this parlay with, this author is underestimating how relatively difficult that is, how relatively rarely people do that. Pick up a book and say, I'm going to really live this book while I'm reading it, But video games do a rather good job at getting the player's foot in the door of that. That's a quite interesting way to approach it. Anyway, really cool. A glorious question.